If you're loving the trend for vintage and romantic style tops and blouses this season as much as I am, then this video is for you. Today I'm going to be sharing 5 sewing patterns that you can use to recreate this look, and best of all, they can all be sewn in a weekend. I'm going to be sharing the sewing level for each pattern, the type of fabric that you should use for each one, and I'll also be sharing a little bit about how I think you could customize each pattern to make it even more romantic and vintage inspired. All the patterns that I mentioned today will be listed in the video description down below, and I'll also be sharing some fabric recommendations too. So with all that said, let's get into it, shall we? Pattern number 1 is the Seline blouse by Silver Saga Patterns. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a pattern that's more romantic and vintage inspired than this one. It's just so pretty, isn't it? So the main feature of this blouse is its deep rounded neckline, and it's finished with a delicate ruffle and tie. There are actually 6 different versions that you can sew of this pattern. They all feature this really pretty puff sleeve, and there are optional ruffles and button details that you can add on or leave out as you prefer. If you're feeling as though this neckline might be slightly too low for you, and I can understand that, there is a tutorial over on the Silver Saga website for an adjustable neckline. So it is possible to raise it if you did want to do that. This pattern is rated experienced beginner, so if you do have a bit of sewing experience under your belt, then this pattern would be perfect for you. If you are quite new to sewing and you want to take it easy, then I would opt for one of the versions without the button band, just to make the sewing process that little bit easier. Fabric recommendations for this pattern include lightweight woven fabrics such as cottons, linens. You could use a cotton gauze, perhaps a linen viscose, or even a cotton voile or voile. I'm never quite sure how you pronounce that. So I actually think this pattern is perfect as it is for recreating that romantic, vintage inspired look that we're seeing everywhere on the high street. But if you did want to add a little bit more, then you could play around with adding some delicate vintage lace to the neckline ruffle or even to the sleeve frill too. Pattern number 2 is the Melody blouse by Sage and Lilac Studio. I love this one for its more understated look and feel. It has a really romantic feminine design. I love the higher neckline of this one and the gentle ruffle detail, and I also love the fact that you can make it sleeveless or with sleeves if you prefer, and the sleeves can be made either short or longer for the cooler weather. If you're someone that does prefer a more understated sort of look and feel, then the sleeves on this one are possibly more for you. They're just the right amount of poof, I think, so the puffiness of those sleeves isn't going to overwhelm you quite as much as perhaps the Seline blouse might. For creating a really romantic and vintage style blouse with this pattern, I think it's more about the fabric than the extra details that you might include. I actually have this pattern on my to sew list, and I have the most beautiful embroidered floral cotton to use for it, and I cannot wait to try and sew this one up. So using an embroidered fabric such as this one, or maybe even a broderie anglaise, is a great way to give that nod to vintage style. And I also love the way that they've used a border fabric in one of the pattern images here. It just gives a really romantic summery look and feel, doesn't it? So the sewing level for this one is actually rated intermediate, but I'm going to say that an experienced beginner could probably have a go at this pattern and be okay. If you're feeling a little bit nervous, then use a fabric with a reasonable amount of weight, such as the cotton that I'm sharing here. Having said that, I do think this pattern would work really nicely in something with a little bit more drape, such as a viscose or a crepe, because the pattern is quite lightweight and delicate in itself. So I think it's actually going to work really nicely with both types of fabric. Pattern number 3 is the Daphne top by BF Patterns. The Daphne top is an easy breezy summer top, and it features this vintage inspired squared yoke neckline. There are a few different versions that you can sew of this pattern, including a couple of dress versions, but since we're talking about tops today, I'm just going to focus on the tops for now. So version number 1 just features the squared yoke neckline, these lovely wide straps which are perfect for wearing a bra or a cami underneath if you need to. The armholes are bias bound, and then the front and back pieces are gathered into the yoke. Version number 2 is the peplum style top, and I do have a here's one I made earlier for this because I've recently made this version myself. So the peplum version still features the squared yoke neckline. It buttons down at the front and then ties in at the waist with this drawstring tie. So with both of these tops, I think they're perfect for customizing and making even more romantic and vintage inspired. So with my version here, I've included some vintage lace just under the yoke pieces at the front and the back. But really, if you wanted to, you could go wild with adding extra details to both of these top patterns. You could add lace around the straps, you could add lace in the button band, you could add a frill or lace at the bottom here. For me, I think I would love to have a go at making version A of this pattern. I would make it in a nice floaty solid fabric, and I would decorate the yoke detail and the straps with a big bold rickrack trim, and I think that would look great. The sewing level for this one is confident beginner, so if you do have some sewing experience, you'll be fine sewing up this pattern. What I would say, having sewn one version of this pattern, is that the peplum style top is slightly more difficult, obviously, than the first version of this pattern, because you do have the button band to contend with, along with making a drawstring and drawstring casing. Lightweight woven fabrics are suggested for this pattern. I think you could use a variety of different fabrics for this pattern. I think lightweight is definitely the way to go. So lightweight cotton, lightweight linen. Well, I've used a cotton Swiss dot for my version, which worked really nicely. I think you could also use a viscose or a crepe, maybe, if you wanted something with a little bit more drape, particularly if you're going to be sewing the first version of the pattern, which is quite floaty and oversized. As always, if you're using something with a little bit more structure, the top is going to stand away from your body more so than if you're using a fabric with drape, which will float around you as you move. Pattern number 4 is the Sadi top by Oh Me Oh My Sewing, which is such a great name for a pattern company, by the way, isn't it? So tie front tops don't seem to be going anywhere for this season, and I really loved the design of this one. This one has a V neckline with a tie front closure. It also includes a modesty panel if you prefer to include that. It has big puffy sleeves and a pretty peplum design. Again, I really like the fact that you can make the sleeves either short or long depending on the season, and the sleeves include pretty tie details as well. So I chose to include this pattern because I felt as though there was so much you could do with it. Again, lots of the tops that are around on the high street at the moment don't necessarily have this peplum detail, although it is a very pretty design. But if you wanted to, you could remove the sleeves and just take in the armholes to have a sleeveless version. You could lengthen the top down and remove the peplum. But again, with this particular pattern, I think it's all about the fabric that you use. Loads of the tops that are around on the high street at the moment are sewn from or made from really bold embroidered designs, and I know that it's really popular too at the moment to use vintage tablecloths and things like that, and I actually think they would be perfect for this kind of blouse. Sleeveless tops similar to this are all the rage, but of course if you want maximum impact, then include that big puffy sleeve and also the peplum as well. A really great way to maximise that peplum would be to use a border print fabric, much like the top that I'm wearing today actually, and just include the border print as part of the peplum, and that gives you a really pretty romantic style hemline. The sewing level for this one is confident beginner, so again, if you do have a bit of sewing experience under your belt, and possibly if you would like a challenge, I would say, as this one is slightly more involved than maybe some of the other patterns that I've shared, absolutely give it a go. Fabrics recommended are light to medium weight woven fabrics. Again, I think for this one, depending on the type of fabric that you use, you're going to get a different result every time. If you are using a structured cotton, like a cotton poplin, even perhaps a more structured broderie anglaise, you're going to really emphasize those big poofy sleeves, and your peplum is going to really stand away from your body. If you don't necessarily want to make that kind of impact and you want something more understated, then choose a fabric with a little bit more drape, and then your sleeves will hang closer to your body and your peplum will swing and hang around you rather than sticking out. Pattern number 5 is the Rosamund blouse by Madwick Studio. I thought this blouse was perfect for the kind of collars that we're still seeing around on the high street this summertime. Collared blouses have been around for quite some time now, haven't they? But I think this summertime we're more seeing them with like a squared sailor style look. The blouse itself in this pattern is oversized and the collar is actually optional. So if you do find that at some point you're not quite as on board with the big oversized collar trend, then you can sew this blouse without the collar if you prefer. The pattern includes long sleeves with a cuff. This one is a button-up top. The buttons are actually fastened with button loops rather than having to sew buttonholes. So if you are someone that worries about sewing buttonholes, then this option might be a good one for you. So in terms of making this one a little bit more vintage or romantic, inspired, there are loads of things that you could do with this pattern, particularly with regards to the collar, I would say. So there are loads of blouses around on the high street at the moment that feature lace on collars. And so depending on how wild you do want to go with this romantic and vintage inspired look, you could experiment with including delicate vintage lace around that squared collared outline. You could add lace just running down the collar if you wanted to, and you could also add lace or crochet trim or something to the button placket of this blouse too. I've also seen a few blouses around on the high street with crochet and embroidered trimmings around the sleeve cuffs too, and I think that looks really pretty. So again, just another option or another way to go to bring your blouse more up to date and on trend. With a large collar like this, you could also experiment with embroidery on the collar, and I think that would be a really lovely detail. If you're not a fan of embroidery, then perhaps try some machine applique or even hand sewn applique. There's just so much you could do with this pattern, I think. The pattern itself doesn't actually have a sewing level rating, or at least not one that I could find, but again, I think confident to advanced beginner would cope really nicely with this pattern. It does have a couple of tricky details involved, like sewing the button details and even sewing the collar too. But I think if you have a little bit of sewing experience under your belt, this would be a great challenge for you. Fabric recommendations for this pattern are lightweight woven fabrics again, and I think for this one, soft cotton gauze, cotton voile, cotton dobby, or even a soft linen viscose would work really nicely for this blouse. I think a fabric with a little bit of weight but also some drape is going to work really nicely for this pattern. Another thing you could do, and I'm not sure how possible this is, I'm just putting it out there, is that you could experiment with adding some lace panels down the front of the blouse too. If you want to be really clever, you could add them into the main body of the fabric, but you could also sew, either machine or hand sew them just onto the fabric that you're using. And I think that would be a really nice touch if you could do it. So that brings me to the end of my list of 5 vintage and romantic inspired tops to sew this weekend. Please do let me know in the comments if you'll be sewing any of these up for summertime. I'd love to hear your suggestions for adapting these patterns to make them even more romantic and vintagey. And if you have sewn any of these patterns up already, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments too. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I wish you happy, romantic, vintage inspired sewing, and I'll look forward to catching up with you in my next video. Bye.